It's great to be here in Toronto again today. I love coming up here. It's such an amazing city. It's weirdly hot and humid. I'm not really used to it feeling like the south of the United States here in Toronto, so it's weird. It feels like home, but it's not supposed to feel that way. So I need 2 volunteers, preferably students, if we have any students in the room. Just 2. No students? No students. All right, just 2 volunteers then. Don't be shy. I see 2 there in the back. Come on up. Yep, you 2. Come on up. So I learned something interesting while I was trying to get some money for this, is that Canada doesn't actually have $1 bills like we do in the U.S.
No, we're smarter.
So you're totally smarter. It's such a waste. So you have $1 coins, which is cool. We do too, but nobody uses them. So we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to have you play a role, and you play a role, and I'm going to give you 10 $1 coins.
Fantastic.
All right?
Good start.
It is a good start, but only for them, not for y'all. So what you're going to do is you're going to make him an offer. You're going to give him 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, or 10 coins, and you have the option to accept or decline her offer. So do that for a minute. Make him an offer. You're going to accept or decline. If you accept, you both get to keep the money. If you decline, I get the money back.
All right.
That's how it's going to work. So take a moment, talk about it. Once you're done, come back at me, let me know. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about people, processes, and patterns. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is the idea of people and how we interact with each other. Now, this exercise is interesting. We're going to kind of see what they do. They're just slow, which is fine, totally fine. I know. So while they're wrapping up, my name is Bermon. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been coming to FITC for a while, and I really enjoy these types of events. There's a really great community here in Charlotte, and what we're going to figure out today is what are some of the best ways that we can communicate as human beings. We're going to talk about code a little bit, but not a lot. The focus is going to be on people and how we interact with each other, because we always build things together. It looks like they've made a deal. Let's see what they do. All right. So, what did you come up with?
I came in high. He came in low. We went with a 50-50 split and built a relationship.
Okay. Good deal. So, a 50-50 split. Why did you do a 50-50 split?
I totally screwed up and was coming in I was like, I'll give you $6 because I was looking at actually carrying some overhead because it's hard to negotiate when you both know what's at stake, right? Or what you both have in hand.
Correct.
So I totally blew it. I don't know what I was thinking. Not enough coffee.
No, you did totally fine.
Right?
Totally fine.
But no, Kevin's response was really awesome and totally not realistic in the sense of what to expect on an everyday basis. And he's like, we can either have a transactional relationship or build a relationship. So I took him up on his offer to do a 50-50 split and build a relationship.
All right, good deal. Give him a hand. You can go sit down.
Really?
Yeah, I was serious.
Okay, cheers. Thanks. Coffee.
You're welcome. So, now I made a prediction before we did this, and my prediction was a 50-50 split. Ta-da! That's the magic. We can all go home now. It's done. Now, there are varying reactions that I get when I do this with people. When I do it on a conference stage, the most common is a 50-50 split. There's some public pressure to be fair, right? Now, I did this a while ago with a handful of teenagers. It really wasn't a 50-50. It was all over the board on what they wanted to do. That there were less social pressures. There were some splits. Some folks declined it, so I got the money back. Some of them actually felt bad about taking my money and gave it back to me after they agreed, which was kind of weird. That's what they did. So the reason that I bring this up is that as we talk about things today and talk about people and how we interact with each other, the thing to understand is that people aren't really logical and rational all of the time. In most cases, we're irrational in our interactions with each other. So we're going to focus on 3 things today, really. We're going to talk about people, we're going to talk about patterns, and we're going to talk about process. So the first question really is, why are we so dadgum irrational as human beings? Now, there's an author that I really like. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he points out that people aren't fully irrational or rational, nor are we completely selfish. We do things based off of what he refers to as our cognitive bias. The unconscious and irrational brain processes that distort the way that we see the world. We see this a lot. I mean, I'm from the U.S. There's a lot of conscious and unconscious bias going on right now, which is super sad. We won't talk about it very much. But this is kind of why.
My nose.
How did you get a Lego in your nose?
I don't know.
Is that a Lego person head?
Yeah.
How did it get up your nose?
I don't know.
Did he climb up there?
No, I put it in there.
Does it hurt?
No.
Would you like some help getting it out?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I help you with it? I'm gonna need some tweezers. Let me see.
I got a Lego in my nose, a Lego head.
Okay, I'm gonna get some tweezers.
It's not funny.
You're right, it's not funny. It's not funny at all, buddy. Here, I got an idea. Just, can you blow really hard? We got it. Are you, are you okay?
Just in case you missed it.
I got an idea. Just, can you blow really hard?
Okay. So human psychology. We're irrational, and we're impulsive, and we're emotionally driven most of the time. All of the intelligence and logic will do little to overcome basic human psychology. Jared Spill has a really good example which made me think of this. He talks about people putting beans in their nose. Now, most of us, I think, we work on software. We build software, in most cases, software websites, things like that. So when we're working with clients, with stakeholders, with teammates, and we're trying to build these projects, people are, in most cases, irrational. And what Jared Spill talks about is that sometimes you're going to have people that want to put a bean in their nose, or in some cases, a Lego man head. And you can do all that you think you can do to try and convince them that putting the bean in their nose is a bad idea. But some people, irregardless of logic, are just going to stick it way on up there. And then, in most cases, we talk to them afterwards and go, hey, so how does it feel to have the bean in your nose? Is it comfortable? And in most cases, they go, no, it's not really comfortable. Then we can go, all right, let's help you get the bean out of your nose. And then sometimes it's messy to get that done. Now, the reason that we're like this as human beings is that it's easier for us to stick with what we believe based on what we've heard or what our own biases are. We make assumptions, so many assumptions about others before we even meet them. We ignore our own perceptions, and we typically try and conform our lives to the conclusions that we draw from day to day. Now, these assumptions that we make about other human beings, they really muck up our perception and show typically flawed versions of situations that we're in. So most people, in general, really just want to be understood. Like the poor kid with Lego up his nose. He didn't think it was funny. His dad did, because it is kind of funny, but he didn't think so. He just wanted to be understood. We want to be listened to as human beings. When we listen to somebody else talking to us, like really listen, it demonstrates empathy, and it shows a sincere desire to understand another person. So feeling listened to helps people clarify their own thoughts and feelings, and that's an important concept that we're going to focus on a little bit today. And it also helps people become less defensive and oppositional. If you've ever seen, I'll avoid politics, I apologize, Twitter things. Blah. So some techniques that I want you to keep in mind as we talk about some of the more tactical things that we do in our day-to-day lives as we're building projects together. One is a concept of active listening. Now, we tend to focus all of our listening sometimes when somebody's talking to us to figure out what we're going to say back to them. So we spend a lot of time in our own head figuring out our response to what they're saying to us. And when we do that, we're not really talking. We're thinking about what we need to say next. And because we're thinking so much about what to say next, we're no longer listening to the conversation and to the things that the person's saying to us. So listening has everything to do with making it about the other person, validating their emotions and creating enough trust and safety for a real conversation to begin. So the goal, as we're building projects together and we're talking and interface with other human beings, is to identify what the other person needs most, whether it's monetary. Folks have $10 now, or $5 a piece, which is great, emotionally or otherwise, and get them to feel safe enough to talk about what they really want. Now, in order to listen effectively, one of the things that we need to do is to slow it down, but slow it way, way down. Now, if you rush your conversations with people, it puts the conversation at risk. So by slowing the conversation down, you also provide an environment where it can be safe, where they feel like they're being listened to. So, slow it down. Slow it way down. By slowing the conversation down, you're creating an environment of measured calmness, which is really important if you're trying to move forward together as two people or a group of people. The second thing that is important is your tone. Now, when we're engaging in conversations that don't feel safe, our brains automatically flip into fight or flight mode. Me personally, I'm a flight mode. I'm from the southeast of the United States. I don't enjoy conflict. I don't enjoy arguing. I don't enjoy those types of environments. Bless my heart. So when emotions kick in, we do one of those two things. And slowing things down, slowing the conversation down, slowing the interaction down, allows our brains to process and understand what the situation is, what the other person is saying, and really what their intention is behind the words that are coming out of their mouth. And that allows us to better understand what their feelings are and what their intentions are. Now, it's only possible to really understand what somebody is thinking by grasping what they're feeling. And feelings are messy. They're hard. They're really hard to understand. So the tone of our voice can be very powerful because so much can be inferred on how we're speaking. Now, being from the South, I typically have a slow and measured tone. Some might call it soothing. Some might call it boring. It depends on who you're talking to and how I feel that day, I guess. I've also been gifted with a much lower voice, which kind of helps. So there are really three ways that we can use our tone to influence the conversation that we're having. The first way is a positive and playful tone. And for the most part, this should be our default. When we're smiling and you can feel the warmth coming from the other person. You come across as easygoing and good-natured when you smile and you're energetic in the way that you speak. The trick is to really come across this way is to relax and to smile. Even if you're on the phone, it really helps, especially if you're frustrated, to crack a smile and have that conversation with the other individual. It helps put people in a positive frame of mind. And if they're in a positive frame of mind, they'll think more quickly and they're more likely to collaborate with you on what you're trying to do. The second one, this is my go-to, my default, is this slow, deep, measured, and reassuring tone. I learned this from my father, who has always spoken this way. He's always been very calm, even when situations were fairly dicey. And what that does is it allows him to take these conversations slowly, deliberately, and to focus on really the other person. It also helps other people feel that you're in control. When you're speaking in a slow and measured tone with a downward inflection, there's no room for, am I questioning myself? It's slow and measured. So when you use an upward inflection, you've brought a measure of uncertainty and you've lost control of the conversation. The third one is the assertive voice, and this is the one that you want to avoid. This is the least ideal because it signals dominance over somebody else. And this causes people to typically go into fight or flight mode, and in some cases be aggressive back or passive-aggressively push back on what you're trying to ask them to do. So as an experiment today, as you leave the room and you're interacting with other people in the conference, do me a favor. Smile at people just randomly. I know it's going to feel kind of weird, but do it, and I guarantee that most of them will smile back, even though they don't know who you are, because it's a reflex that we have as human beings. And it's a reflex because we typically engage in something that's referred to as mirroring. So it's essentially imitation. And we do it as an unconscious behavior where we copy each other. Speech patterns, body language, vocabulary, tempo, tone of voice. We do it to comfort each other. So it's a sign that people are bonding and building trust. So when you're walking around and smiling at people, you're building trust with them, and they're going to do it back because it's a natural thing that we do. So essentially, the reason that we do this is because we fear things that are different, and we're drawn to things that are similar. Intentionally using a mirroring technique with other people as you're having conversations signals that, hey, we're alike. You can trust me. We can have this conversation. You can tell me what you're really feeling. Now, in practice, when you're engaging in a conversation with somebody, the way that mirroring works is that you're simply repeating back the last 3 or 4 words that they said to you in the form of a question. By repeating back what people say to you, you trigger this mirroring instinct that we all have. And it causes the other person to elaborate on what they just said. Now, this is a process that we use a lot when we're talking to stakeholders or clients, since we work at a consultancy. They say a lot of things, and some of those things, they don't really mean what they say. So we use this as a way to uncover what they really intend us to get out of the conversation that we're having. The way that it works, we're going to use a slow and measured tone, right? We're going to slow it down. And then we'll start with, I'm sorry, and then take the last 3 or 4 words that they said to us. So if a client says to us, I want to make the logo bigger, which happens sometimes, we go, I'm sorry, make the logo bigger? It's really that simple. It sounds ridiculous, but it is such a simple thing. And what that causes them to do is to elaborate more on why they want the logo bigger without us asking them, why do you want to make the logo bigger? Why is a naughty word to say? Because it will instantly put people on the defensive. Because you're questioning their judgment, you're questioning their reasoning, and that's not really what we're doing, really. So if you ask somebody, what do you mean and why you're doing something, you're going to put them on that defensive. So mirroring helps us get clarity from our teammates, from our peers, from our leaders, from our clients, while also signaling that we respect what they said. We don't quite grasp what they're really getting at with their comment or question, but we really want to try and understand what they mean. 2, labeling. Now, people's emotions have 2 levels. There's the behavior that they present, what we can see and hear, and then 2, there's the behavior that they don't present. These are the underlying feelings or motives behind their behaviors. Now, empathy is something that you hear a lot in the design community, and it's a bit overused, but essentially empathy is understanding the feelings and mindset of another human being, trying to understand and hear what's behind what they're saying. So labeling is simply a way to validate somebody's emotions by acknowledging it. Now, by giving somebody's emotions a name, you show that you identify with how they feel. So it's really a tactic and not much of a strategy. Now, labeling is a shortcut to empathy. It allows us to expose negative thoughts and make them feel less frightening. It applies rational words to fears and frustrations and disrupts raw emotion. Now, labeling also helps us address underlying feelings and emotions. If they're negative, we can diffuse those. If they're positive, we can reinforce them. And the way labeling essentially works is that somebody is saying something to us, and we're taking what they've said and we're putting a label on it. In a sense of, if somebody asked us to make their logo bigger and we went through our mirroring technique, and that they still didn't quite get there, we might use something like labeling in it. And it would be something like, it seems that making the logo bigger is really important to you. Really simple, right? And they can either confirm or deny that. Yes, it is really important to me, or no, it's not. And we can ask questions from there to try and figure things out. The next step of this is something that we call paraphrasing. This is my personal favorite. It's the most effective. So before you can convince somebody to see your point of view, you have to say things again to say, yes, that's right, or that's not right. It demonstrates that they're embracing what you said, they hear you. So the more a person feels understood and positively affirming that understanding, the more likely they are to constructive behavior will take hold. So the more effective conversations will be. So paraphrasing looks or sounds something kind of like this, in that we're going to apply a label on how the person is feeling. It seems like, it feels like, it seems like this or that. And then we're going to summarize back what they've said to us. So it's sort of like mirroring, but instead of using their words and just parroting them back to them, we're taking the idea or the thought, lumping that into an it seems or it feels like or it sounds like, and then paraphrasing back to them in our own words what they've said to us. And the intent behind that is to have them say that's right or that's not right and clarify. So we use those three techniques pretty often as we're communicating with clients or teammates or project managers or whomever else. The reason that I bring this up first is that the reason projects fail is not because the project is hard or because the technology is hard or because the features we've been given is too much for us to do within the time frame they've given us. Projects typically fail and always fail because of people. And people fail because we don't communicate well with each other. So as we talk about the rest of these examples, I want you to keep that in mind, that every day we're working with teams and managers and stakeholders and peers. We're working with other people. And it's important for us to navigate those conversations effectively. Otherwise, our projects continue to fail. Now, if you want to learn more about some of these communication techniques, there are a couple books that I think are great. One is Crucial Conversations. I worked for them years ago. They ran everybody through the types of things that I just talked to you about. Another great one is a book called Never Split the Difference. It's from a former FBI hostage negotiator. A lot of really great techniques, a lot of really practical things that you can start to apply. Part 2 of this, we're going to talk about process. Now, out of curiosity, how many people in the room work for a product company? A lot of folks. Who works for a large enterprise, banks, government, things like that? Small startup? Who's a freelancer? Education? Like one, couple hands? Okay. Did I miss anybody? Agency, thank you. I always forget the agencies. Agencies. All right. The front row, all agency. Process is a difficult thing because it involves people, but in some cases it's difficult because we choose the wrong types of processes. Folks can be very dogmatic about how we're building software together. This is from Deloitte. This is how they view the various process ecosystems that exist. You have things like SAFe, which is a scaled Agile framework. You have normal Agile. You have Scrum. You have Kanban. You have Lean UX. And they've kind of taken many different frameworks and processes, process methodology, and shoved them into one subway system diagram is kind of what it looks like. I don't understand all of what they're trying to get across here, but it's a lot of data. We're going to focus on a little bit more simplistic things and processes that we're all mostly familiar with. The first one is probably just a traditional Agile process or a Scrum process. Who currently uses some form of Agile in the work that they do? Who uses Kanban? Scaled Agile, anything like that? Any other Agile type frameworks? Who's stuck in the glories of waterfall? Bless your souls. I feel your pain. It totally happens. So who's not using any of these and just building stuff? It's totally viable. There's nothing wrong with that. A traditional Agile process, if you're not familiar with it, is you're taking all of these features or ideas that marketing or quote-unquote the business want to try and build, and those go into something called a backlog. And the backlog is really just a prioritized list of things that they want to put into the product. And then those items in the backlog are broken down and assigned to what is typically called a sprint or an iteration. They could be anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks. Those are kind of the norms. And they're taking a subset of those features, and they're building them and then shipping functional software. And they do that over and over and over again, either until the project is complete, and they never are, or time and money runs out, which is typically what happens. We're out of money, then we have to stop building. So you do this over and over and over again. It works in most cases. Personally, I think this is a really great framework for development tasks. But when you're building products, everything isn't just development. And that's kind of where things struggle a bit. When I look at agencies or development firms or IT consultancies or even some companies that are fairly development focused, this is what they really focus on. They focus on building things that are functional. And it kind of works. People can come in, they can click around, and they can hopefully get things done. The next level is you might have some designers on the team, and you're taking this functional thing and giving it a nice little shell, making it look pretty, quote unquote. Where the value really lies in building great products is really in the center. So if you're lucky, you might have some researchers and UX folks that are really focusing on making the software useful, making it usable. And then in the core, where I think the real value lies, is making sure that any feature that we're putting into the system, anything that somebody is going to use, really has value. And the only way that we can really figure that out is through research and validation. Now, the way that we get to this point, to make sure that we have a product or features within a product that provide value, they're useful, they're functional, and also visually appealing, that's kind of the core four. You have to understand how a requirement or a feature makes it through the pipeline. So at Cardinal, we've been experimenting with various ways to build software to try and find the best fit for us. Now, we typically come into a company and we build something for you and then we go away. We don't really maintain things, which I think is amazing. I love not having to maintain the software that I build and just, here, it's built. Good luck. Have fun. But to get to that point, this is kind of what it looks like in my mind. This is how we see this. The first thing is that whenever you're building a product, whether it's large or small, you have a list of requirements. And those requirements are coming from the CEO, the CTO, marketing, the business group. It could be coming from the technology group. It could be coming from the designers. There's just this list of things that people want to build. And it's messy. It's really, really messy. And in order to make sure that these requirements get built, there are a few things that have to get done. Just starting with requirements and building those is dangerous because those requirements really are just assumptions. And within those assumptions, there's a whole bunch of risk. So if you want to effectively build projects, build a product as a team, you have to reduce your risk. And the only way to reduce your risk is to break down all of these ideas into much smaller ideas. If you can't get to that point, the chances of your project failing is pretty high. So what we do is we take these ideas, we know they're assumptions, we know that they're things that we need to validate, and we break those down into smaller ideas. Some are bigger or smaller than others. And then we take an individual idea that's still kind of messy in its own right, and we begin to break that down. So we use a process that we call the discovery and validation life cycle. That looks something kind of like this, where we're taking those assumptions. It's the CEO said, I want my logo bigger. He's assuming he needs his logo bigger. We don't really know that he does. We're going to make sense of all the problems that he's trying to lay out for us. We're going to brainstorm solutions, and we're going to determine the areas that we're going to focus on. Once we have an idea of what we want to try and focus on, we run that through what we call a validation cycle. And that validation cycle allows us to build something, to measure what we've built, to learn from what worked well, what didn't work well, make adjustments, and continue that cycle until we reach what we feel is a good stopping point. Now, when I say build something, we're not necessarily building something in code. We don't have to go that far because code is expensive. We do a lot of paper prototypes, clickable prototypes. We use InVision a whole bunch. For anything on mobile, we typically use Principal so that we can figure out some of these really interesting animations and interactions that might exist in the mobile platform. And we get those in front of people. So for anything that's public-facing, it's much easier, especially if it's like the e-commerce space. You can go out and you can find customers, have them test a subsection of what you're trying to build, and validate whether or not it works or not. Once that we go through that cycle, those really nebulous ideas become validated ideas. They have some meat behind them. We know what the good ideas are versus the bad ideas. And then those ideas go into what we call the delivery backlog. So the delivery backlog is what our developers are actually going to be working from. There's enough information and documentation behind those ideas so that they can break those down into sprints and start to build a product. So those ideas that are validated now go into the backlog. In the backlog, those get assigned to iterations or sprints. and then we get working software, and all the magic happens, and it's done, and it's great. The reason that we find this beneficial is that we're validating early. We're validating when it's cheap, and we're getting to the right idea much sooner than just building a whole bunch of stuff and hoping for the best. I had a client a few years ago, a large energy client, that had built a fairly large, robust document managed software. And it was a healthy 7-figure plus project that we were involved on. They just went off and built it. They built it waterfall, and they brought us in after 2 years of building the software to let them know if it worked or not. So it was kind of that, we're going to build everything and hope for the best. The best was like a very low bar. We spent a week setting up a usability lab and doing studies with folks that would use the software. And when we're doing these types of studies, we typically evaluate a few things. One of those things is time to completion. How much time does it take for them to complete a task? And what is their completion percentage? Can they complete all the tasks that they need to do in order for the product to be effective? We're typically looking for something that's around 78% or above. They were in the high 50s, low 60s on a lot of those. So almost half of the application wasn't usable. People couldn't figure out what they needed to do. And at this point, you've spent a healthy chunk of change and a lot of time. And to then go back and fix things that could have been fixed much earlier becomes even more expensive. So the conversation that we have with clients is you're either paying with it less up front or paying a lot more later on. So the way we view this overall process is what we call a dual-track discovery and delivery model. That looks something like this. So we have designers and researchers and UX folks that are simply sitting on top of the discovery track, where they're breaking down those ideas, and those ideas are feeding into the delivery track. The delivery track are where the developers are really pulling those ideas and building those. We find that this is beneficial because it allows us to more concisely define what we're building earlier on, but it also allows the team to have earlier conversations around what we're building. What this isn't is we don't have designers and UX folks and product folks that are sitting alone in this discovery track, and then developers are just sitting down here below in the delivery track. There's a lot of ebb and flow in those conversations. We have developers in discovery because somebody's got to pull the designers back and help them be more realistic, right? Designers like to think really, really big, and sometimes those big ideas are cost and time prohibitive for us to actually develop. So those conversations happen with the entire team, or at least the leads of the team, depending on how large the project is. That way, when a developer is pulling those ideas from the backlog, there are no surprises. The developers know what they're trying to build. So the discovery track essentially looks like this. We have a discovery backlog. We run these through our discovery and validation cycle. Those go into validated ideas. And we're essentially using sort of a Kanban board, which allows us to manage work in progress and how much we're trying to tackle at any given time. The delivery track looks like this. It's a basic Scrum. We're not really doing anything magical here. They have a list of validated, prioritized items in their backlog. They're pulling those into sprints, and then they're delivering working software. The reason that we do this, there's a concept in Agile called the definition of done. The definition of done is typically we've built features, we ship features, and QA pass without any defects. That's not quite enough. So what we want to do, we want to change the definition of done in that we've built features that are appealing and functional and valuable, and they're useful. That's how we see definition of done in the process that we're trying to push within our own organization. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, there are 3 books that I recommend, Lean UX and Sense and Respond, both by Jeff Godhealth and a handful of other folks, and then Product Leadership that just came from the folks at Pluralsight, which all great books if you want to understand about process and people and how we interact with each other. Now, the funnest part to me are patterns. So we're going to talk a little bit about pattern libraries and what they are, and how we can use these conversations to make sure that we're being effective in what we're doing. Now, we have a project that we're working on out of North Carolina for the Department of Transportation, trying to make the DOT site better. Now, to help drive those conversations between the business stakeholders and our designers and researchers and our tech teams, is we typically focus those conversations around a pattern library. Now, you hear a lot of terms being thrown around. There's design system, there's pattern library, there's style guide. The way that I personally view this is that the smallest subset of that is a style guide. The style guide defines what are your brand colors, what typography are you using, what's the various sizing, what's the grid system look like, how are you handling imagery and content. If you take it up a level, then you have what we're going to focus on today, which is a pattern library. This is where the code bits come into play, where we're taking the style guide and the brand and applying that to the UI in a series of patterns. And then a design system is much more holistic, where you're probably using this pattern library across multiple products, and you've created this large holistic design system that lets you build multiple things with your single pattern library. We find that this is really helpful for us in that it helps us shape our design and development workflows and help drive a better understanding around UI problems. What's going to work, what's not going to work. What is the best way to solve this problem with an interface? And then the next step is really what is the core of a pattern library and kind of how is it built. And it's typically that there are core bits, there are components, there are patterns, there are templates, and there are pages, and it kind of grows out from there. At the core, this is where what I would consider a style guide would come into play. There's the global branding, content, behavior guidelines that are being applied to the components. That's definitely not all that goes into a style guide or at the core, but it's a representation of kind of what would be in there. The next level up are the components. Now, this is the piece of the website or the application. It typically includes behavior, presentation, like how the branding and the look and the feel applies to various components. There is code here, responsive, accessible, performant, and tested code behind each of these components. So search bars, drop downs, tables, all of the various inputs that come into play, all those live there in components. And then patterns are essentially a collection of components that are combined together to give you various patterns. So there might be an address pattern, and that pattern might be different whether it's United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe. The format of those fields and the names or labels of those fields are different. So therefore, they're different patterns. Patterns typically have their own documentation. And then the next level out are templates. So you're taking everything below that, core, components, patterns, and you're putting those together to build templates of pages. And then ultimately, you have the pages themselves. So pages with real content that allow us to rapidly test and figure out, is this the best flow for a human being to go from point A to point B? Now, the reason that this process is useful is that it forces you to have conversations. It forces you to have conversations with the designers, with the developers, with the product owner, with the business stakeholders to figure out, in most cases, what in the world do we call this pattern? I don't know. There's so many ways you can name something, and it's really hard sometimes to build a really robust naming convention that you can use throughout your application. So first and foremost, it really helps build that shared vocabulary. You can't build the vocabulary unless you have conversations. And you can't have effective conversations if you don't effectively mirror and paraphrase and label, because folks get really torn up on the inside on things like spaces versus tabs, or am I going to use BIM or SMAX or OCSS or anything like that. So those conversations need to happen, and they need to be effective for the team to move forward effectively. Now, pattern library is useful for a few reasons. One is that it helps drive consistency. How many folks in here are front-end devs? I'm assuming most of you, because it's kind of what this conference is for. How many times, and maybe you haven't recognized yet, but how many times have you gone through your code base and noticed that you have 10 or 15 different colors of blue or red or whatever because you've taken out the eyedropper and just, that looks like the right color, I'm going to use it, and stick it in a SAS variable or just stick it in my CSS or whatever. It happens, right? If there aren't conversations around the system and how we're taking the brand and applying that to what we're trying to build in the system, it's really hard to maintain consistency. The second challenge around consistency is that if you're building large products, over time, things get out of whack. It gets complicated because you may leave or somebody may come in. You may be adding new people to the team. And it's really difficult to ensure consistency when there's a constant ebb and flow on what's going on. For the folks that work in large enterprises, there's typically numerous teams that may or may not be doing similar things that you are, and they're doing them just a smidge different. But you typically don't communicate with the other teams because there are fiefdoms and like, this is my group, we're going to do it my way, and that's how people feel most of the time. So Pattern Library offers a really easy way to provide a central level of documentation for the entire team, technical or not, and make it easy to quickly duplicate existing patterns when you're adding things to a new page. Second thing is that large organizations specifically need to be able to use some of this stuff. We have a large financial client. They have 3 pattern library teams building essentially the exact same thing, but 3 times. They're not talking to each other. We know about it because we have folks in each of those teams, and we talk to each other because that's kind of what we do. When one developer creates a new pattern, it ideally should go into the system so that other developers can use it. It should be available for future projects. And then the third thing is maintainability. If you're building and testing things at a pattern level, ideally the pattern itself is well designed, the interactions are correct, it's already accessible, we're all doing accessibility right because that's the good thing to do. You just nod if you can nod, and if you don't nod, just do it when you get back. It's really important. We're all doing things that are accessible. The things that we're building are responsive. That's kind of the norm now. There's no reason not to. That maintainability is really important. Now, in companies, there are various decision makers, whether it's marketing, IT. There may be a forward-thinking CTO or anything like that that allows us to do more of this stuff. We kind of need their ear. And then within your company, you can kind of gauge how mature you are based off of how you're building products together, whether they're inconsistent. There's really no pattern library. You're just kind of building stuff and hoping for the best. There are static libraries. This is a great place to start. There are numerous platforms that allow us to do that. You can put patterns in. It spits them out as static HTML. That's really great. You can do manual pattern libraries. There's some code. You have to manually update it. It's not fully integrated with your dev environment. The ideal is where you have these automated pattern libraries and governed pattern libraries. Who's currently playing around with React? As a front-end developer, I hate it the least out of all the frameworks that are out there on the JavaScript side because it focuses on just the view. And what that means for us is that we can take those individual patterns, we can write those in React, and we can export or include those into applications. So when we're building applications now, we typically have a core pattern library, and it lives on its own. And then we're pulling in those patterns in the application. Because it's React, and it's devoid of properties and state, and we can pass those in from the application, it makes it so much easier. And the reason that's important is that it gives you a single source of truth, not just for your HTML and or your CSS and your JavaScript, but also for your HTML, the view itself, which has been our biggest challenge in the past. So to kind of wrap up, I think my overall point is that projects are easy and people are hard. It's important to remember that as human beings, we're rational, impulsive, and are emotionally driven. However, in the end, we really just want to be understood and accepted. So as you're talking with other people, keep this in mind, right? Actively listen, choose your tone, mirror, label, and paraphrase. You'll be surprised how much better your conversations go, even around the mundane things. So again, my name is Bermon Painter. Thanks for listening today.